Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the State Library of New South Wales. We've had many significant occasions in this auditorium, which is only 2 years old, I think about now. But tonight's extra special. Indeed, it's a very historic event. I acknowledge all of you, and I acknowledge the very many distinguished people in the audience tonight who come from the worlds of politics, history, media, and public service. I'd like to begin, of course, by acknowledging that the library stands on Gadigal land and that these lands have been cared for and nurtured by the Gadigal people for millennia. I pay respect to elders past, present, and I extend that respect to any First Nations people amongst us today. We celebrate the diversity of First Nations cultures and languages across Australia in all the work that we do here. And I thank in particular our Indigenous engagement team and all the staff for leading this work with passion and conviction. Tonight we're going to hear from two outstanding speakers. We're incredibly honoured tonight to be joined by the Honourable Paul Keating, the 24th Prime Minister of Australia, to discuss leadership, policy and power and reflect on his time in politics in conversation with journalist, historian and biographer Troy Bramston. This event, of course, marks the publication of Troy's definitive new biography, Gough Whitlam, The Vista of the New, published by HarperCollins. Troy, of course, sits on our Library Council and also is here tonight is our Library Council President, the Honourable Bob Davis, and other members of the Library Council and Foundation Board. Thank you for joining us tonight. The State Library, I believe, is best placed for an event like this, as there's an intersection of three great minds, Gough Whitlam, the Honourable Paul Keating and Troy Bramston, whose history, work and legacy are threaded through this place and our collections. We've really been delighted to be working with Mr. Keating on the transfer of the PJ Keating Personal Archive to the library. And I thank my predecessor, Dr. John Vallance, who began that process that I have been carrying on with the great team here. Mr. Keating's papers, spanning more than 5 decades, from 1969 to 2024, are a remarkable and meticulously curated collection of material that documents pivotal moments of Australia's contemporary political and social history. The archive provides a rich and distinct narrative on the shaping of Australian policy and identity, particularly during his time as Treasurer and then as Australia's Prime Minister, when of course he led transformative economic reforms. This collection will be housed in a dedicated PJ Keating room at the library and will stand as testament to Keating's commitment to recording the national story with both insight and historical consciousness. We look forward to sharing more about this significant project in 2026, our 200th anniversary year. Thank you, Paul, for your commitment to this library. I also welcome Troy Bramston, of course. Troy is a senior writer with the Australian newspaper, reporting on politics, policy and popular culture. He's an award-winning and best-selling author and editor of 12 books, including Bob Hawke, Demons and Destiny, Robert Menzies, The Art of Politics, and Paul Keating, The Big Picture Leader. He was a co-winner of the Australian Book Industry Award, finalist for the Walkley Book Award, shortlisted for the National Biography Award, and shortlisted for Australian Political Book of the Year. And just quietly, I did happen to see that it's trending as #1 on Booktopia today. So well done, Troy. He was a judge at the Prime Minister's Literary Awards in 2021 and 22. And Troy not only sits on this Library Council and has been for the past year, but he's also a member of the National Archives of Australia Advisory Council. Now, I spent a good part of the weekend making, well, I thought significant headway, but some headway into 700 pages, and I can tell you what a wonderful reader is. And there are 2 special mentions of Whitlam in this library. The first being the celebration of his 80th birthday on the 11th of July 1996, where he blew out 80 candles on a chocolate cake. Thank you for that detail, Troy. I also learnt that Gough himself, wait for it, performed a scene from Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet here with Margaret at the library in 2003. Oh, to see that. And some of you may have seen that. And then the photo on the screen is of Whitlam and a young Troy Bramston. Well, a younger Troy. I think you were 19 at the time, in quite a special tie, and you should have worn that tie tonight. This was at the Damien Pera wartime photography launch. We think in about 1995. Indeed, there are many wonderful passages in this book. He writes, Whitlam lived a life anchored in the assemblage of facts and figures recorded in quotidian detail, writing dates in Roman numerals, detailing every flight he ever took in logbooks, indexing volumes of Hansard, and maintaining a bank of filing cabinets stacked with correspondence, newspaper clippings, and reporting for over 60 years. In a short, a librarian's dream. So Keating, of course, was a backbencher and minister in the Whitlam government, and we will now hear from him on this defining period of Australian history, including his own prime ministership. Welcome, Paul, and welcome, Troy. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Caroline, and thank you all for coming. One of the great honours of my life is to be Paul Keating's biographer. As Treasurer, he is the architect of the modern Australian economy, and as Prime Minister, he gave us the big picture approach to politics that made us think big about our Indigenous history, our place in the world, and our future. There is nobody like Paul Keating in public life, a bold and brave leader who understood power and leadership like few others. What we're going to do is begin with the dismissal of the Whitlam government on the 11th of November 1975, and then continue on with Paul's reflections on the Whitlam government and then his own government and some contemporary issues. The dismissal anniversary is 50 years ago next week. There are very few people who were in politics at the time who are still with us. But Paul was a minister at the time, and he was there on the day it all happened. Of course, the budget had been blocked in the Senate, and Gough Whitlam had decided on a half-Senate election as a resolution to the crisis, and then John Kerr, the Governor-General, dismissed him without warning. We're going to start with a clip from the 1983 mini-series, The Dismissal, how it ends, just for a minute, and let's see if you can recognise who is standing next to Gough Whitlam on the steps of Parliament House. So there we have it, two Labor Prime Ministers. Let me start, Paul, by asking, if you were Prime Minister on the 11th of November 1975 and dismissed without warning by ambush, what would you have done?
Well, as you know, Troy, I was with Gough the last time that he saw Kerr at Government House on the previous Thursday. I was the third person in the quorum for an Executive Council meeting of three. And the reason I was there, I was recently appointed Minister for Northern Australia. And Gough's friend, the Mayor of Brisbane, was to be appointed Chairman of the Reconstruction Commission of Darwin, which I had in the portfolio. That's what took me there, you see. So I was waiting outside with David Smith, who was the meeting which Gough was having with Kerr in the main room, if you like, the main reception room at Government House. And then at a certain point I was invited in to be the third party. Well, of course, when I went in, there was huge guffawing going on, huge laughter. And I thought, this is encouraging, because this is the penultimate point of the crisis. This had been going about 5 or 6 weeks, you see. And we were looking for indication whether Kerr was going to accept Gough's advice, you see. So so boisterous was it, I said, well, would you like me to come back a bit later? They said, oh no. Kerr said, oh no, stay. He said, we're just talking, we're just amusing ourselves of how Murphy and Barwick deserve each other. You see, this is what the discussion was about. And Gough said to me, Murphy wants a uniform for a female tipstaff, which Barwick won't provide. And then it went on with more stories and more stories and more stories. See? So anyway, there was one laughter after another, one joke after another, So finally, Kerr says, look, well, we're here to exact a couple of important decisions of the Executive Council. So there was Clem Jones' appointment, and there was 2 other matters, and it just required, and up we got. Then we walk out. I mean, some people here may have been to Government House, but there's a big long corridor out of the Governor-General's office down to the main steps. So I'm walking with Gough, and Gough says to me, with Kerr, he says to me, look at that lionine mane, because Kerr had this great head full of hair, you see. And I said, well, I'll never have that, And anyway, so Kerr waved us off as we got into the car. And of course, being the last minister in the government and only 3 weeks ago, and by the way, Gough had voted for Mick Young, not me. So I was not one of his favourites. So I wasn't able to say, well, is it all agreed, So I said to him, well, he seems all right, Gough. And he said, he's entirely proper, he'll do the right thing. In that voice, he's entirely proper, he'll do the right thing. That was the first indication I had that Gough didn't know what he would do, right? So the politician in me said, well, there's something not right here, right? We're at the sort of wrong point in the process, and yet the Prime Minister doesn't know what the Governor-General has in mind, right? So, of course, the next time Gough saw him was on the Tuesday, and of course he went to Government House with a letter to advise him for a half-Senate election, and Kerr gave him a letter dismissing him.
So that told you that it was a supreme deception?
Oh, absolutely, because I was witness to it, It couldn't have been any more deceptions.
So Paul, if you were met with that dismissal, what would you have done to John Kerr?
Well, firstly, I wouldn't have appointed Kerr. So I appointed Bill Dean later when I was Prime Minister. I had no comparison between them. Kerr was a very strange figure. I see, self-possessed. Look, I ran across him in 1971. He was appointed to run an inquiry about parliamentarian salaries, and both parties sent a couple of people to see him. I was one of them, for the Labor Party. He had contempt for us, really. He thought he was sort of above the parliamentary scene. I would think, But what was your question again, mate?
What would you have done if you were in Whitlam's
well, at
position?
first I said I wouldn't have appointed him, but the thing is, I would have, if Gough's political nose had been right, I would have gone to Kerr's office the next time with the advice with 2 of my staff officers, but they wouldn't have been staff officers, they would have been civically dressed police, members of Commonwealth Police. And then if he'd have dismissed me, I would have arrested him immediately. Yeah.
So you would have put the Governor-General under house arrest?
Well, you'd have to do a couple of things first, and this is where Gough I don't think understood the real exercise of power, Firstly, you would have squared away the Chief of the Defence Force, the CDF, and told him that the Governor-General was suspect, and that he, the CDF, should not take advisings from the Governor-General, who may present himself as Chief of the Defence Force. And once you had that, you couldn't have... See, let me just say this to you. I'd been through all this before with Jack Lang. See, I met Lang twice a week for 7 years, you know, and I'd been through the dismissal in New South Wales. And Lang told me the reason he accepted the dismissal because he was breaching a Commonwealth Act about payments, and that there was a coalition Prime Minister who was in 34.
So that would have been Joe Lyons, was it?
Joe Lyons, yeah. That essentially the Commonwealth Police or military would have reacted against the New South Wales Police. So there would have been a sort of a nasty scene, which Lang believed he couldn't win and wanted to avoid. But on this occasion, there was no such parallel, you understand? So it would have been important if Gough had had the... And it turns out you've turned up these advisings that the Solicitor General, who was at the time...
So Morris Byers.
Murray Byers, told Gough he could be dismissed.
That's right. So there are memos after memo that I've uncovered for this book where Whitlam is repeatedly advised he is at dismissal risk.
Yes.
So this penetrates to the point you're making, I think, Paul, which is that he didn't do any contingency.
No, he had no plan. No plan at all. So the thing was, when I got back from this meeting, I thought, should I say to him, I think this bloke's going to KO you, you know? So I went around to the just outside the Prime Minister's office, which was then only attended by no police in those days, just a member of the household staff, you know. And there's those long green benches, which were done in green leather, you know, in the 1930s. So I sat on one for about 5 or 6 minutes, and this guy is staring at me, and he wonders what I'm there for. And I was there to go on and see him and say, look, this is pretty suspicious. But in the car coming back, after he told me that he's entirely proper, he'll do the right thing, he never said another word. Now, whether he was chewing all this over or not, I didn't know. Anyway, I thought, what do? He'd voted against me for Mick Young. He thought the New South Wales right of the Labor Party were basically boneheads, to be honest, you know. So I thought, look, in the end, I thought, is it my place to go and tell him that the Governor-General may execute him, you know?
Yeah.
So
well, of course, on that same day, Bill Hayden sees him at Government House before you were there, and Hayden had the clear impression that there was a dismissal risk. In fact, he goes and he tells Whitlam that I think he's going to sack us, and Whitlam responds to Hayden he wouldn't have the guts. So Whitlam is advised by many people that Kerr is untrustworthy. Yep. And what I wanted to ask you about, Paul, was that what happened, of course, after the dismissal is that he goes to the lodge and eats a steak.
Yeah.
Now, you told me for the book that you think he's under some kind of psychological shock. Can you explain why?
No, I don't, but I can't really, because, you see, the condition precedent for Fraser becoming Prime Minister was to be able to guarantee supply, but if the Labor government had not presented the bill to the Senate, such a condition could not have been met, right? So Gough had not told Ken Reid, who was our leader in the Senate, about this, in which case if we'd have held the budget bill back, then supply could not have been guaranteed, you know. And secondly, the House of Representatives had voted no confidence in Fraser, you know, and that motion had been extended to and the Queen always made it clear that she would accept the advice of her ministers and principally the Prime Minister. So, and in your I notice in your book you say Kerr was worried that he would be dismissed and someone else would be appointed. You see.
That's right. He was worried that if he had been open with Whitlam about the crisis and how it could possibly be resolved, then he would be at risk himself. But can we just explain this point, because I think it's really important. So Gough Whitlam's strategy that afternoon, after retiring to the lodge and eating a steak on his own, he summoned some colleagues, didn't tell any senators that they'd been dismissed. He's focused on the House and passing a resolution of no confidence in the new Prime Minister, which happens, of course. Yeah. But the main game is in the Senate. Now, the Labor senators then voted for supply without knowing the government had been dismissed, which reinforces Malcolm Fraser in office. He had now delivered supply, which Whitlam could not. Tell us why it's important what happened in the Senate, because if Labor had not supported supply, maybe kept the place sitting or suspended it, that could have unravelled the dismissal?
Kerr would have had to rethink it, I think, But look, I think the thing is this, that with malice aforethought, Kerr planned the expropriation of an ancient kingly power which had not been used for 200 years in fulfilment of his own personal prejudices. This is what happened here, right? Knowing all along he was contemplating an illegal act, the dismissal of an elected government, and as it turned out, dismissed by him, a usurper, a vagabond, fundamentally,
Yes.
And this is why Kerr was not entitled to any legitimacy. There was nothing legitimate about what he was doing, or status before the law. Every motivation by Kerr was illegitimate in this exercise.
Now, let me ask you about this, because one of the other things I discovered in the book, which you know about, is these handwritten notes that John Kerr had written in the years before he died, where he said that it was his duty and his destiny to dismiss the Whitlam government, and he had acted to preserve the reserve powers and protect the Senate's right to block supply. Why is that wrong?
Well, why it's wrong, because it's outrageous, because he knew, both being a lawyer and an interested in constitutional law and as Governor-General, that the British Parliament, that the House of Lords had refused the passage of the 1909 People's Budget, which had been constructed by the Liberal Party in Britain, by Lloyd George and Churchill, and had been knocked over by the Lords because they'd introduced an age pension and support for the sick, paid for by a tax on land which had gone up in value because of essentially the cities of Britain rising in population, And so to resolve it, there were two elections in 1910, both of which were won by the government, by the Asquith government, two. And in 1911, the British Parliament passed the Parliament Act, which forbade then the Lords refusing the money bills, the budget bills of the House of Commons. And that was agreed to by King George V against the royal assent. So Kerr knows full well that the Mother Parliament, which had given us our constitution in 1901, that 8 years after that the Lords had refused to pass the money bills of the Commons in Britain, and with two elections to try and resolve the crisis, it gets resolved in favour of the Liberal Party, and King George V, who the first part of the crisis starts when Edward VII is still alive. He dies, King George V, his son, takes over, and he gives it the royal assent. So the king, the monarch, has given the assent to the power of the Commons against the power of the upper house. Why then would Kerr be taking the role here of the Australian Senate against the House of Representatives?
Right, and
without any justification whatsoever.
Yes, and when I interviewed Harold Wilson, the British Prime Minister, his staff in 10 Downing Street, they told me there was dismay that this could happen. They thought that the reserve powers were redundant. And these powers could not be exercised. So there was shock in Downing Street for exactly the reasons you say.
Well, he expropriated, as I say, these sort of kingly powers and used them to his own view, and then tried to manufacture reasons for it. And see, the two things he says, his two reasons are that he wants to protect
the reserve powers.
The reserve powers, which had last been used 200 years before. 200 years before. And secondly, he wants to confirm the Senate's power to block supply.
Yes.
This is still, by the way, this is still the power that the Senate has. This is why I call it, the Senate, what's the name I gave them? I can't remember now.
Unrepresentative
swill, yeah.
Are you having a lend of us there, or?
Yeah.
I could hear people saying it before you even said it.
Yeah, I know. Well, the thing is, you see, under our constitution, to protect the smaller states, they have equal numbers. So each state has 12, right? So if you go to Adelaide, for instance, we've been to Adelaide, the city of Adelaide, 12, so you can have one on every corner. In Adelaide, 12,
So you still think it's unrepresentative swill?
I still think it's unrepresentative. So therefore, and you see, the outcome of all this is the Senate could do it again, you see. Now, they'd run the problem of, I'll tell you, in essence, what was going on here was this. Two things. We had a chaotic government. It lost confidence of people and would have lost an election. And you had an opposition leader in Fraser who couldn't wait 18 months for a poll. And Fraser wanted to push the government of the day to an election at a time of his choosing, not the Prime Minister's choosing, right? What Kerr should have done was said to the Prime Minister, look, I don't really want to be in this position, but it looks like I have to resolve a deadlock. What do you have in mind? And he should have said, well, what I have in mind is a half-cent election. But a half-cent election wouldn't move the numbers enough to give passage to the bill, right? To which the Governor-General says to Fraser, Whitlam's agreeing to a half-cent election, and Fraser says, no, I want a full election, because he knows that he could defeat Whitlam at that particular time, right? So if Kerr had have said decently to Whitlam, look, this is what you say, Gough, but this won't resolve things, Fraser's going to press on, in which case, if you give me a recommendation for a general election, you can go to the general election with you as Prime Minister. That's what should have happened.
Yeah, I agree with that entirely. Before we move off the dismissal, Paul, I want to ask you about Queen Elizabeth II and her staff. Some years ago, the correspondence between Kerr and the palace was revealed. Do you think there's any evidence that the Queen, who you knew personally, had encouraged the dismissal or green-lighted it in advance?
None whatsoever. None whatsoever. I know there's a lot of this around, but none whatsoever. Look, when I went to see her at Balmoral to tell her in the nicest way possible we didn't need her anymore, which is tough. If you're a queen, it's a pretty tough message, really. But she was really nice for me, and she said, look, I will always take the advice of Australian ministers, and at the time, of course, she had terrible trouble at the time between Charles and Diana, and I'd said to her, I gave her a commitment that I would never bring the family into the debate, which she was grateful for, and I'd struck her a few other times, so I mean, to the extent that you get along with the monarch is a bit hard to say, but I got along pretty well with her.
Didn't she drive you around in the Land Rover at the Balmoral estate?
Yeah, but after that, she said, after I said to her that Australia became a republic, but we're still a member of the Commonwealth. She said, I think I need a stiff drink, she said. So I said, well, make it two. So we had the two. So then we were supposed to have a black tie dinner. She said, look, I've got a better idea. Why don't we have see, what had happened in Victoria's day, the Prince Consort had nearly died out on the fields in the winter, and she built a place for him out there, so he could go out hunting and not be too far from home. Anyway, so the Queen drove us out in Land Rover, and Phil was out there doing the barbecue. You see, and it was an interesting thing because she said, "Help me unload the plates." So they had a trailer, so you lifted the trailer up, and they had like a green felted set of shelves, and so you took the plates out and took them in, and she laid them all out, and Phil made the thing, and then we did the reverse, and she said, I helped her wash them up, She washed them, I dried the things up, etc. Put them all back in the thing. So it was a bit of an amazing night. But I'll just say one thing about King Charles. She said, look at him down there. She said, you think butter wouldn't melt in his mouth? She said, it would, you know.
All right, let's go back to 1969. We've been showing some photographs of you, Paul, as a young political candidate. I mean, you win pre-selection for a safe Labor seat, toppling a sitting member at age 24 in 1968. You're elected to Parliament in 1969. I say in the book that Whitlam was a young man in an old man's party, but you were even younger when you were elected. What did you make of the Whitlam caucus that you arrived in 1969?
Well, they'd been out of office, nearly all these people. Very few had ever been in office. And the few that had been out of office 23 years. And there was no over... I mean, look, Gough did two great things for us. He saved the Labor Party and he finished the Menzies torpor of Australia. You know, the fact that, you know, we ended up in sort of intellectual hibernation, which is where the country was in the Menzies years, you know. And of course, Gough was an imperious kind of guy, which the Libs hated, of course, you know. And we liked, not that we liked the imperialists, but we liked the fact he was our imperialist. See?
And of course, we've got some photos here of the 1972 campaign, the famous It's Time campaign. And then after that, after Labor returns to office, you make a bid to be a minister. Yeah. Now, at that stage, you would have been 28 in Cabinet and you missed out by one spot in the caucus ballot. Yeah. You still a bit cranky about that?
Oh, no, not really. I mean, I had time to think about where the country really should be going, etc. Look, you know, Gough, he saved the Labor Party. He did terminate the Menzies torpor. It was a sort of an awakening for the country. He had a sense of leadership, firm sense of leadership about him, but he didn't have the political wherewithal, you know. I mean, you don't get a seat in the House of Representatives at 24 if you don't know how the machine works. The thing ticks, you know.
Well, let me ask you about that. We have a picture of that's the 72 campaign. There was a picture of Arthur Calwell before, who was Whitlam's predecessor. Now, you knew Arthur Calwell. You're in your first term in Parliament. He's in his last. Yeah. And there's another picture we've got of Rex Connor, who also was a famous minister. Now, you gravitated to some of these people. Tell us why you sought to learn and understand about how the place really worked from these people. What did you see in them? Well,
they had congealed wisdom. You know, they'd been around so long, they'd learned a lot. You know, and you know, Arthur could speak Mandarin. You know, you wouldn't believe that, but he could. I used to come to the Haymarket with him in Sydney, and he'd speak Mandarin. They had a great interest in the classics and history. You know, and Rex Connor was interested in. You know, he came from Wollongong. He's interested in steel issue, national development, this sort of thing. You know, so I found them kind of interesting people. You know, and Arthur, of course, you know, he was not the most attractive personality, and he had a speech impediment, which didn't help him, but he could put together a great speech, you know. I remember, in fact, I pulled this off the Christmas card list one day up on the board, there's a caucus board, and I found it about a couple of weeks ago in my office cleaning up stuff for the library, you know. And the caucus chairman asked members to put money in for the staff Christmas party, for the attendance, you know. And Arthur scribbles on it. When I was leader, I paid personally for the attendance. You may ask my elongated successor to do the same. So it's in handwriting, you know. That's how things were.
You thought, I'll have that for the archives.
I've got that. Yeah, I got that one. I pulled that one off the board. That was too good to leave there.
Now, the Whitlam government is one of these governments that has towering, lasting achievements. We all know what they are, you know, the Medibank, the legal reforms, no-fault divorce, needs-based school funding, the list goes on and on and on. But it was turbulent and it was chaotic and it was scandal-prone. Now, you become a minister in 1975, but of course also in 1975 is the famous Terrigal Conference. And we've got a photo of the Terrigal Conference because it's one of my favourite photos of all time, with all these ministers in their Hawaiian shirts, and you can see Bill Hayden there with his white shoes. Now, you're not in that photo, Paul. Did you own a Hawaiian shirt? Did you wear it to the Terrigal Conference?
No, I wasn't a member of the Federal Executive, so I wasn't there, you see.
What does this photo tell you about the Whitlam government? Because what did you learn when Labor went into opposition about how to run a government?
Well, the show was kind of chaotic. It had 27 ministers in the cabinet, the old cabinet room, which was dead square, and there was the government had no overarching narrative. There was no storyline of the kind I developed for Hawke and for myself, you know, the internationalisation of the economy, I opened up all of the financial markets, all the product markets, all the labour market. You know, it had none of that structural sense about it. It would do a good thing here, a ping there, or something there, or something there, and the cabinet meetings were unbelievable, you know. Joe Berenson, who just went before me into the cabinet, he said, "You can't believe how mad it is, really." Interesting, when I went in, I took Rex Connor's place, you see. So I go to the door, and there's only one empty chair, that's Connor's. So I go, and Gough said, "Don't sit there. Don't you sit there." I said, "Oh, okay." He said, "Bowen, you sit there." So Bowen gets up and moves there. So I go to Bowen's place. He said, "No, don't you go there." I said, "Gough, I'm happy to stand here." I said, right. So finally, I sit down in the place that Bowen had, and it was a discussion about discussion about manufacturing industry, and Kep Enderby was the minister, and so Kep had this strange, monotonous, monotone style. So Gough's getting angry at the front. And Gough finally says, "Enderby, you garrulous bastard, when will you shut up?" Right? So Berenson goes in and says, "I told you, this is how it is, you know, this is how it is." And that sort of, and so Gordon Bryant said, "You can't speak to him like that." And Gough said, "I'll speak to any of you bastards any way I like," right? So this is the cabinet meeting, you know. I mean, like the Hawke and Keating government, we ran cabinets like a papal event. Yeah.
Let's talk about leadership. You've often said that leadership is the combination of courage and imagination. Where did you first get an idea about political leadership and an understanding of power? Because it seems to me, writing your biography, and we had many discussions, from the moment you arrived, you're interested in power and you're interested in leadership, about how to change the country. Yeah. So where does that come from? Is it something that you're learning and talking to these older figures?
I think what attracted me to Lang was the horsepower he had. So I met him in his late 80s, but he had, he's an amazing figure, you know, because the sheer determination of power, I'd never run into anything like that. I mean, the two people in my early life I was really focused on was Churchill and Roosevelt, you know, more in common with Roosevelt in policy terms, but essentially, you know, looking at, you know, the British Conservative Party gave Churchill the Prime Ministership on the basis he would do a deal with Hitler, you know, and the Foreign Secretary was in the guy they wanted to give the job to was in the Lords, you know, and in those 5 days in May in 1940 in London, he personally turned the Conservative majority, cabinet majority around so that he would get their support to not deal with Hitler and not deal with Mussolini as some sort of go-between, you know. And on that went the freedom of Europe, you know. And the thing about Churchill didn't win the Second World War, but at the penultimate point, he didn't lose it. He didn't lose it. And of course, Hitler then put his forces all onto the Soviet Union, and Britain escaped after you know, the aerial bombing. So Churchill was always, for braveness, my guy, right? The smarter guy was the 20th. Churchill was an Edwardian person, a 19th century politician. That's how he viewed the world, you know, where Roosevelt was a 20th century politician. And Roosevelt's accomplishments, you know, winning 4 times and taking America out of the absolute depths of poverty in the Depression, you know, still is the great thing of modern history. So these were the 2 I followed here. And for local stuff, I had Lang telling me, you know, Lang was at Henry Parkes's rallies. So he'd give you a sketch of every one of them, you know. Hughes, you know, Latham, all these people, you know, and it was remarkably kindly about them as well, you know, remarkably kindly.
The other thing, Paul, I think, is that the big picture style leadership that you became famous for when you became Prime Minister in 1991 and then won a 5th term, which no government has ever won since. Do you think governments today in the recent decades are adventurous enough, are bold enough, are creative enough? Do they have the big picture approach to politics?
Well, the worst thing that can happen in this game is you lose your job, you know. That's the worst thing. It's not the end of the world, right? So they're 3-year parliaments, so there's no point in being a mouse. None whatsoever. You know, you may as well go for broke all the time, burn the capital all the time. That's what I used to do. I used to say to Hawke, look, we'll be lucky to be here 6 years, so let's do everything. Let's do everything we can, you know, keep our foot on the accelerator. And of course, basically, you know, I used to say to the caucus, I'm the road runner, and these libs are trying to drop a brick on me, but I'm so fast that I keep winning, right? And so the speed of the changes, you know, I mean, you know, this is the reformation of the Australian economy is still the post-war model around the world. That's why that's why it's so wealthy now. And nothing to do with the bloody Liberal Party, of course. Nothing at all.
Well,
you know.
Let's whip through a few issues. One of the strands of your big picture approach to politics was engagement with Asia. You once called it a magnificent obsession. There's a photo we've got of Gough Whitlam going to China in 1971. And of course, that was opposed by the coalition, and then he went in 1973. How would you deal with China today? Because it seems to me the same criticism that's made of Whitlam in 1971, 72 is the same criticism that's been made today. Yet this relationship is the basis of our modern prosperity. We depend on China as our major trading partner. How should we approach China these days?
Well, China, the implication is China these days is like the old Soviet Union. Well, of course, it's nothing like the old Soviet Union. You know, it was a member of the IMF, the WTO, the WHO. You know, you had Xi Jinping 4 years ago in Davos proselytising for globalisation. You know, what the Chinese believe is order and progress. You know, they don't want to tip the Americans over. You know, but the Chinese have committed the great sin of internationalism. They built an economy bigger than America. That's their sin, you know. The IMF and the CIA both agree this year Chinese GDP is 40 trillion and American GDP is 30 trillion, right? It's a third bigger. But in terms of purchasing power parity, I mean, what they can build a machine, a car, a destroyer, a submarine, at a fraction of the price and numbers you couldn't believe. See, look, so of course I mean, you see me say this, I'll say it again. I was in the unlikely event, I was very praiseworthy of Trump in his first term because of foreign policy, right? Trump is a kind of peacenik. He's not a member of the peace movement, but he has a philosophic commitment against bloodshed and war. No, it's not a bad thing to have, you know? And so therefore, I think while ever he is president, that therefore he's too street smart to know, even if he wished to take notice of the Pentagon, that there's any chance of any sort of military defeat of China. What does an American defeat of China look like? You see, in 1945, after Hirohito, the emperor, after the Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Hirohito sued for peace, and MacArthur was the consul, if you like, you had American military police in managing Tokyo, Yokohama. Well, imagine American military police in Shanghai and Beijing today with 1.4 billion Chinese. You know, I mean, what does an American victory look like? Yeah. You know?
We have another photograph of Whitlam meeting Richard Nixon in 1973. You told me that you don't think the US alliance was under any sort of jeopardy in that period, even though they had strong disagreements. But I'm interested because you met Ronald Reagan in the Oval Office, you met Bill Clinton in the Oval Office, and you hosted George H.W. Bush in Australia. So you met 3 US presidents in office. How would you approach Donald Trump?
Donald Trump is a power guy, you know, and if you showed the slightest, he can pick a fraud. I'll give him that. He can pick a fraud. So if you showed the slightest sign of weakness, you're buggered with him. That's what I think, you know. So I think I can say this. I did give our Prime Minister a heap of fighting points in the event that Trump turned nasty on him, you know. Turned out he didn't have to use them. And it was all because I think what had happened in the White House, they'd fought the Canadians, you know, they'd fought the Europeans. I think they decided, look, it's about time we got a bit friendly with some of our allies, you know. And so therefore the meeting went really well. But I think the Prime Minister was up for having of throwing a punch back if he received one. And I think this is the way to handle it. But look, the thing is, in the Pacific between the United States and China, it's all over. It's all over. The Chinese have won, hands down. It's all over. You know, they can outproduce people. They'll dominate technological capabilities. I mean, I knew Zhirongji, the Premier, very well. In 1999 and 2000, he was telling me he was setting up 5 universities that did nothing but mathematics. Nothing but mathematics. That's 26 years ago. You know, so all this feeds into this huge machine they have there. And of course they back it in financially. So the thing is, what China is today in terms of modernity, capacity, utilisation of services is like nothing in human history. Nothing the Americans did in the 20th century or before the war is even anything or past early the happy years of the 50s in America. There's nothing like it, you know. And of course, I think that, I think also Trump has a view about near power for the Russians and for the Chinese and for themselves. Trump's primary interest is in the Western Pacific, is in the Western Hemisphere. That's why he's interested in Greenland. So that's why he's also interested in Canada and Mexico, because they're in the Western Hemisphere. He doesn't care about Europe. He's told them they can go and look after themselves. And I don't think he cares about East Asia, broadly, you know. And so the other thing is, I think he has a view about these places like the mafia has a view about mafia families. There's a New York mafia family doesn't disturb Chicago, you understand? And the Chicago family doesn't disturb the family in Florida, right? I think this is Trump's view about foreign policy. He lets the Russians keep their near region. Yep. He wants to settle that war, which I hope he can do. He's the only one certainly in America does want to do this. I think he certainly has the same view. That's why he said about Xi Jinping recently, "Don't you worry, it'll be all friendly with the Chinese." Yep, So I think that's it. I think that's it. So, in other words, he's a great power guy who believes in the power of these regions, a little bit like the mafia family model.
Yeah. Interesting. Now, one of the other aspects of the Whitlam period, of course, was land rights. We have this famous photograph taken by Mervyn Bishop, whose photography is going to be exhibited here at the library, pouring the sand into Vincent Lingiari's hands. Now, Mabo, you told me the Native Title Act in response to the Mabo judgment was probably the thing that was the most important thing that you did, one of the things that you're most proud of.
Hardest thing.
Hardest thing.
Yeah.
Can you reflect on that legacy now? Because, again, something that was fiercely contested at the time, but now... What's the latest figures? It's more than half the continent is under native title.
The blacks have got 62% of the country now. And I noticed last week, did you notice that they had two big decisions in their favour in the Cape York?
Yes.
Yep. So I think when all the cases are heard, they'll probably end up with about 65 or 70% of the country. See, the issue the issue of a title by a state land manager under the High Court's principles extinguishes a native title. So the title under this building is extinguished. The title under your house is extinguished. But out in the boondocks, along the coast, under the Native Title Act, if they can establish that they had an association with it and lived some sort of traditional life, they can make a claim on it. So I think they'll end up with about 70%. But when I started with it, I had just, the High Court hung me out to dry. What they really said, look, there's an ancient title in the common law, in the common law, belonging to Indigenous people. We don't know what the title is, who has it, or how you get it, right? But I had the Labor government in Queensland and the coalition government in Western Australia ready to extinguish the titles. So if I hadn't have got the Native Title Act into place, that's what would have happened. So I started working on it at the end of end of March 1992, and I finished it 3 days a week in the cabinet room in November, nearly in December. I got Gareth to get it through the Senate in December, but I sat there, so I had to write the Native Title Act. It's a massive piece of cultural and property law from a single piece of paper. That's how it started,
One of the other aspects of your legacy, of course, is putting the Republic firmly on the agenda, and we have a photograph of Whitlam meeting the Queen. He modernised the Queen, changed her style and title, and did some of these kind of things, introduced Australian honours system, a new anthem. But we still haven't severed that final constitutional link. Yeah. How frustrating is it for you that there are now 3 Labor Prime Ministers after you and a Republican Liberal in Malcolm Turnbull who haven't advanced the Republic one iota?
Well, I had it in the policy speech in 1993. It wasn't something that might happen. It was actually mainstream. And in the election of 1996, had I won, support for the Republic was at 71 or 72%. But the question was, do you believe Australia should be a republic, for which we had 71 or 72% approval? When Howard won the election, he wouldn't put that question. He put a proposal for a presidential figure appointed by both houses of Parliament because he knew it would be a dispute. Whereas if he'd have asked a simple question, do you think we should be a republic, it would have been answered in the affirmative strongly, in which case it would have gone on. But I mean, how pathetic is it? Look how pathetic it is for us now. We're sitting here with what the remnant bits of the British royal family, they're the sort of king and queen of Australia. I mean, you know, it's just a terrible joke. So actually, but it proves the other point is, at all of these referenda, if the Prime Minister's not supporting them, they don't win. See, Howe didn't support the referendum and it didn't win, even though there's a great background to doing it, right? So you've got to make the case for the Republic and then go after it. And so that means you've got to put skin in the game. You know, that's what, see, I outlined, not just put it in the policy speech, but I outlined a full model for it in the House of Representatives in 1995, you know. I mean, it's just shocking that we're in this situation. I mean, how do you go to Asia, to the Indonesians, to all the indigenes here and say, you know, we're turning over a new leaf, you know. But by the way, our head of state is a monarch of Great Britain, you know.
I totally agree with you there. In the remaining minutes we've got, Paul, I just wanted to touch on a couple of other issues. One of the aspects of your Prime Ministership was known for its great oratory, the Redfern Park Address, of course, the speech at the interment of the unknown soldier. These are some of the highest forms of oratory we've seen in Australian politics. But you were also known for your verbal assaults in Parliament. I'm going to remind our audience about a few of them and then get you to comment. It was said that you had a tongue that could clip a hedge. You said that when Andrew Peacock returned as Liberal leader, you asked, can a souffle rise twice? You characterised Malcolm Fraser as an Easter Island statue with an arse full of razor blades. You called, and I was there when you did this, you called Alexander Downer the Christmas turkey. You said Peter Costello was a low-altitude flyer. John Hewson was a shiver looking for a spine to run up. And then, as most of us would know, you explained to Hewson that you wouldn't call an early election because I want to do you slowly.
Yeah.
Tell me about Parliament as psychological warfare. Is that what it is?
Well, I always believed that you had to keep the psychological control of the place. You know, in the 13 years we're in office, see, Bob was never any good in Parliament. He didn't like the question time, you know, and he hadn't the contempt for the Liberal Party that I have imbued in him. You know.
Do you think there's enough indignation in public life these days?
No, there's not. You've got to be indignant to get social changes through. You've got to be indignant about what people suffer, you know. But the thing was, I ran the show. See, why are you doing this? You're doing it to advance the country's interests for real changes, not faux changes, not ideas, but real changes, you know. And to have that, the government's got to have authority in the Parliament. You know, you don't win 5 elections in a row without that. So they used to get up, you know. So I was, you know, and I used to also liked a bit of humour and the brutality, you know. You know, like that, when that, I said about Downer, you know, he asked a question, I said, Mr. Speaker, you know, you haven't even got to bait the hook, they just jump on the hook for you, you know. You know, I mean, you know, and that, the leader of the National Party, Fisher, you know, I used to call him Daisy, you know, Daisy the cow. When he'd get up to do a question, I go, ding, 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 you know, okay, you know, it psychologically does them harm, you know.
Now, Paul, the other thing that marked your Prime Ministership, and indeed your entire public life, we've seen it from those photos from 1969, is, and you said it to me once, that you were a power dresser. You emanated power and you emanated style in politics. You got to look the part, right? I mean, if you want to be powerful. And the library has these magnificent photos taken by Laurie Graham, now part of the collection. There's you with the Ray-Bans on, and they became a cover story for Rolling Stone magazine. Tell us about looking powerful as well as being powerful.
Well, I think that Menzies, even though he was rotund, he wore what do you call it, a suit?
A double-breasted suit.
Double-breasted suit. I brought double-breasted suits back into fashion in my period as Prime Minister and Treasurer because I was so elegant, you know, so elegant. And so see, Howard said to me one day, he said, you don't think there's a place for us in this Parliament, do you? I said, I do, John. under my boot, under my shoe, you know, under my shoe, you know. And so you know, and of course, this is where I'll tell you about the rising twice. You know, can I say? Bob had no sense of the Parliament at all, for none. So what happens is Peacock gets elected for a second time. It's then the Prime Minister's task to congratulate him. That's fine, you know. So Bob does this outrageously positive speech about him, says, you know, the leader, of course, he was Minister for the Army, and he's also, he's the person who brought independence to Papua New Guinea, and he's the one who had arguments with Fraser about Pol Pot, and he goes on, and our people are going, God, what is this about, you know? So the next speaker is a member of the National Party, right? And then the next speaker is me, you see? So I got up and I said, well, Mr. Speaker, you know, to be elected a leader of a major party in Australia is a great honour, but to be elected twice is a singular honour. And they're all looking at me, the Libs knew how much I despised them. They're looking at me saying, you know, and I said, you know, and, you know, the Prime Minister's been through the leader's record, his history in Papua New Guinea, his contest with Fraser over Vietnam, and also over other issues, including Pol Pot, and it goes on. And I got and my mob was saying, God, you know, I thought they were the opposition. You know, the Libs are going, oh, you know. And I said, but look, Mr. Speaker, the leader's election is going to do one other important thing. It's going to resolve one of the great conundrums in our public life, and that is, can a souffle rise twice? You know. And you know what? He never got over it. It killed him. It absolutely killed him. Yeah.
Paul, let me finish.
Oh, by the way, I had said about Costello that he was all tip and no iceberg. Of course, that's entirely true as well.
You did. You once told me also that to be any good in politics, you must have the crazy gene.
Yeah.
Now, there are so many multifaceted aspects to your personal life and your public life. I wanted to finish by asking you about the importance of the inner life in politicians. And I've been able to explore your interest in music and art and architecture inspired by the Enlightenment. Tell us about why that's important for politicians to have another world that can help fuel their public contribution.
Well, it's the more superior world. It's the more superior world, isn't it? I mean, you know, none of us will ever know really, not here, whether we have an eternal life, you know. But, you know, Mahler said when he wrote to his wife, when he put the Third Symphony together, he said, I think I've crossed over. I think I crossed over, you know. In other words, instead of being sublime, meaning subliminal, I actually crossed over, you know. And I think art in its highest forms, particularly music, which I think is the highest form of the arts. Music has a direct impact on the psyche which has no medium in it. That's why little kids, as babies, move around to the music. It has a straight impact on the psyche that doesn't need a medium, you know. So therefore, the greatness, you know, I'm in the romantic and the repertoire, you know, Mahler, Shostakovich, Wagner, you know, these sort of people, you know. But the greatness of it is humbling, you know, is humbling. And I used to sometimes, members of the team had come round to my house on a Sunday afternoon for the Monday cabinet, you know, and I'd put something on for them. And I'd say, what do you think at the end of this? And it'd be something great, you know, it'd be Mahler Symphony No. 6 or Bruckner No. 5 or something like that. And I'd say, what? Of course, they'd be lifted up by it. I said, we've just got to do better. You've just got to do better. That's what it makes you do. But of course, So I think so. Imagination. The thing about it, I think music for the brain is like electricity for a motor. You know, it gets your brain running. And so what I used to always keep a spare piece of paper to write ideas down as I was hearing things. You know, so and also in the visual arts as well. You know, I'm basically in the romantic arts. I don't mean romantic in the traditional sense, but the thing is, in the classic arts, we had, people would be judged by whether they played by the rules of painting a la Grec, you know, from 2,000, 3,000 years earlier, or Rome, or what have you, whereas what you saw, you painted what you saw, not what you felt, right? Whereas romantic art is painting what you feel, and the integrity of the artist. That's the thing. And I think I'm that. But also, I've also been interested always in neoclassicism, particularly in the years of the French Revolution, the art of the French Revolution, because the French Revolution changed all our lives. You know, we all live the way we live because of the French Revolution. You know, so I had that always. You know, in other words, I didn't go home from a day with a sort of cabinet papers or departmental notes, but I went home to a family, and of course I went home to the music and the art and the culture. And I think that this is why I was always, like, for instance, you know, I rebuilt the Sydney Symphony Orchestra, pulled it out of the ABC, and of course I don't know if anyone's been here recently, but it's one about the best orchestras in the world, you know, they can play anything. And I supported all the private companies, the Sydney Dance Company, I used to give them, they'd all run, they used to come and see me, they'd all have to be short 500,000 or 800,000, I used to give them the checks out every year, you know, just to sort of keep it all going. But I owe my public life to the arts, really. It's interesting how things happen. I think I've told you the story, but I'll tell our audience. I was with a friend of mine on a bicycle when I was 12, you know, and we'd then been down to Bankstown Airport looking at all the old RAF and American planes that were parked there from World War II, you know. And I came up, and his father was in a war service home in Bass Hill, and he had a piece of music on, and it was called the Warsaw Concerto by an English guy, made for a film in 1940. And the sort of the drum beat of it really got me in, and I said to him, "Do you think your dad had put this on a second time?" So he did. And so it was a World Record Club recording. So I convinced my mother to go down to Elizabeth Street with me and buy it, which we did. But it was the second side. And the first side was Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3, played by a woman called Maura Limpany, who used to play for EMI. And so you know, very quickly, I mean, the Warsaw Concerto was written in the manner of Rachmaninoff, so then I got into Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto, the most popular one, No. 2, then the Second Symphony, and then I got into Tchaikovsky's, and then when I was about 16, I used to work for the Sydney County Council in the Queen Victoria building, and there was a shop called Palings, a music shop there. And this fellow said to me, "Look, I've seen what you're buying, you might be interested in this." He said, "We've just bought 34 or 35, the first ever 33 recording by RCA, and it was a recording of Mahler's First Symphony by Dmitri Mitropoulos, who was the person who brought Mahler to America, really." And I thought, you know, I said, okay. Of course, in those days you had to go to what looked like a telephone box, because, you know, you couldn't take the records home, you know. So of course, I thought all my birthdays would come at once, you know. I mean, I never, you know, you remember these things all your life, the impact of it. It's like when I went to Britain in 1971, the first time I went to see J.M.W. Turner's pictures in the Tate. I couldn't get over the genius of them, you know. These events in life that you never forget, you know. So this stuff stuck with me always. So I always had an eye for great things, whether it was in art or architecture, music, as long as it was good of its kind, you know. So that always took precedence for me over the political stuff. I did the political stuff as a sideline to my real interests, you know.
Yeah. Well, look, I said to the audience that there's been no one like Paul Keating in public life before you were Treasurer and Prime Minister, and there's been nobody after. And I think you've demonstrated that again tonight. So thank you, Paul.
Well, thank you, Paul and Troy. I was recalling, Paul Keating has got no reason to remember this, but I recall standing beside him in an institution on the other side of the domain when he was called to help raise money for the new Asian wing at the Art Gallery. And he made a speech in which the first half consisted of a long and intricate explanation of why his policies for Asia were better than John Howard's. And the second half was a dissertation about the influence of Asian art on Western art. It went on for a long time, but I remember a particular moment in which he's speaking, I believe, of the influence of Japanese painting on the Impressionist movement. He said, it was like, this audience is old enough to, in most part, to understand this joke. He said it was like we walked out of the oyster bar and into Darryl Lee's. So he does that sort of thing all the time, and aren't we all the richer for it? I'm lost in admiration, Paul, and I'm remembering too that you mentioned that the native title legislation continues to do its work. That we kind of don't notice that it continues to achieve results that were scarcely thought possible at the time it was passed. Superannuation, I hear the other day, Australian superannuation now superannuation savings are of such a volume that they cannot all be invested in Australia, and they are beginning to end Australia's 2-century-long balance of payments deficit. So extraordinary things have been done by Paul Keating, and they continue to have this effect on our lives and on our grandchildren's lives. They're going to be. It's a great honour for our library to be able to have the collection of his closely curated papers, and I just want to thank you, Paul, and indeed Troy, for your wonderful work on behalf of this whole audience and behalf of the library, and hope we can continue the association. Thank you. And I'm just going to do some really formal things to thank the team at the library, Carolyn and in particular Lydia Tasker and Maggie Patton for their work tonight, Paul Keating's office, in particular Susan Gruzovan, and I want to mention something that Troy just also mentioned during the interview. Upstairs now, there's an exhibition by the first Indigenous press photographer, Mervyn Bishop. It's open until 8 o'clock, and it includes the painting of Gough putting the sand into the hand of Vincent Lingari. It's worth a look. Thank you.